Welcome everyone to our Ecosystem Services webinar for the National Ecosystem Services Partnership. I'm Lydia Olander with Duke University, and we are having the second of our webinars on ecosystem services and equity today. And we have three wonderful speakers who have joined us today. So we have Kai Chen from the University of British Columbia, Marta Burbis from Arizona State University, and Bonnie Keeler from University of Minnesota. And before we turn it over to them, just very briefly, for those who are new to this community, since we seem to have a number of folks joining, we just want to note what the National Ecosystem Services Partnership is. So we've been around for about 10 years now. We're a community of practice that was started in the United States to build better communication, collaboration, and consistency on how ecosystem services are considered in decision making. And we have a variety of different resources we try to support for the US and for policymakers, decision makers, and for expanding applications. And so we host this webinar series, and we also have a newsletter and a website. And I will note that the presentation today will be recorded and posted online, as was the previous session, and the slides will also be available on our website. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to turn this over to Sarah to get us started.
Thanks. And if you were here for part one, this will sound a little familiar, but I wanted to talk a little bit about why we're here today. So as the coordinators of NESP, we'd like to do our part to raise the level of dialogue on issues of environmental justice and equity and how they're tightly connected to ecosystem services and can really be integrated explicitly in our thinking around social ecological systems. While the time is really always ripe for these discussions, we wanted to leverage the level of attention that these important topics are receiving right now, as the issues of racial injustice are at the forefront of the US, national, and international conversations. So through these webinars, we want to highlight the different ways that researchers have approached and thought about different facets of equity that tie into ecosystem services research and practice to spark conversation and action in the NESP community. So while a webinar or even two can't really begin to share the full breadth of this topic, we hope that you'll walk away from today's presentation thinking about some new aspect of equity and ecosystem services that you might not have considered before. And we hope that the presentations and then the discussion after can help spark ideas for how you might apply these equity considerations in your work. So in terms of webinar structure today, each speaker will spend just about 10 minutes presenting on their focal area of equity and ecosystem services, and then we'll open it up for discussion among the three panelists. So please feel free to type questions into the chat box, and we'll try to get to them at the end of the three presenters. We do already have some questions submitted by participants at the time of registration, and we'll try to intersperse those questions with those coming in through the chat. So with that, I will turn us to our first speaker, Kai Chen. And I'll just give a little introduction to Kai, and then I'll let him take it away. So Kai is a professor at the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia. Kai is an interdisciplinary sustainability scientist and strives to understand how social ecological systems can be transformed to be both better and wilder. Kai leads the Connecting Human and Natural Systems Lab and is co-founder of CoSphere, which is a platform for collective environmental action. He's the lead editor of the new British Ecological Society journal, People and Nature, and is the coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Global Assessment. So he's going to kick us off today by talking about transformative change and recognition considerations linked to ecosystem services assessments and research.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, Lydia. And thank you also to Marta and Bonnie. Really looking forward to this conversation. And thank you to the three presenters from last week as well, which was a really great kickoff. And I'm going to be taking advantage of what the groundwork that they laid in that first week. So it was to not redefine terms and set up the same kinds of frameworks, but really to launch off from where they were, particularly with the framework that Jacqueline Luce started off with. So I want to also acknowledge that I am currently living and now sitting on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation and more broadly the Coast Salish people. That obviously is in and of itself a justice issue, and one that kind of weaves in somewhat into what I'll get to in a few minutes. Now, this is a big topic, and I have more to say than would fit into 10 minutes, but I'm going to do my best. I'm actually going to touch on 3 different points. That equity is fairness as perceived in programs and policies, etc. That it is recognition, including of ways of knowing, and I'm going to get more concrete here, providing some examples in that framework that was established last week. And then that equity also is a fundamental component of transformative change. So first, when we think about ecosystem services, many people immediately think about market-based mechanisms and payments for ecosystem services and other policies and programs that are intended to address the degradation of ecosystem services. And one of the points that we have made over the last few years is that it's really important to think about these programs not only in terms of their distributional outcomes, but also in terms of the way that they place rights and responsibilities and the fairness and the perceived fairness of doing that. And so in this kind of bubbles and arrows diagram of representing incentive programs, where you've got the ecosystem service providers or degraders, so these are landowners or farmers in the upstream, and then you've got ecosystems as the intermediary between the ecosystem beneficiaries, ecosystem service beneficiaries in the downstream, the water consumers in many cases. You often here are putting the responsibility pretty solely on the ecosystem service beneficiaries, at least in theory. This is the kind of cozy and imagination of payments for ecosystem services. And there's reason to worry about that or to think about that from an equity perspective. You know, when this downstream beneficiary is, say, Coca-Cola or a Nestle, and it's moving into a region where there are subsistence farmers in the upstream and they need the water quality to be a little better, and so are compensating those farmers in the upstream for the changes in their actions, that seems fine, right? But when it's the other way around and you've got downstream subsistence users who have been benefiting from ecosystem services like the purification of water since time immemorial and have neither the capacity nor the interest in paying, say, some corporate enterprise to change the way that they're doing things in order to retain the clean water that they have had for so long, that does not seem fair. Thinking about other aspects of ecosystem services, again, it's not just distributional payments for ecosystem services, not just the distributional outcomes, but also just who gets to participate. And as we pointed out in this paper in Ecological Economics, so often these incentive programs, in the effort to be efficient from an economic perspective, have focused on lowering transaction costs and also maximizing individual level additionality, to the extent that that means focusing on the larger landowners, but also focusing on those who have not already been doing the conservation action in question, right? So possibly retaining forests beside streams in the form of riparian buffers as one example, right? And if folks in the landscape, and there's almost always some who have been doing these conservation actions even without being paid, they're then excluded from the program because they've already done them, then that sets up a substantial equity issue, a fairness issue that can greatly undermine the perceived legitimacy and the real legitimacy of these programs. So that's just one snapshot. The next point is this point of recognition and the kind of, acknowledging the diversity of ways of knowing and meeting people where they are. So for years, we've been trying to do this. This is work with Terry Satterfield and also Rochelle Gould, Sarah Klein, and others, trying to meet people where they are in terms of their experience of ecosystem services, which means providing these really kind of rich narrative prompts in eliciting perceptions and understandings, experiences associated with ecosystem services, where these codes that we have here on the left are really just, that's our way of understanding what the prompt was most centrally about, right? Never giving people a list of ecosystem services with predefined codes and labels as to how we are insisting that these benefits from nature should be understood. And so this kind of narrative prompt where you have basically kind of an open slate and you're eliciting stories, it yields stories like this. And this comes from Sarah Klein's master's research, where a fisherman said, especially now that I have children, when you cook food that you've caught with your own hands and you set it down in front of your own offspring and it's good food, like salmon that's so good for you, it's a spiritual act. That's such a connection to place, to earth, to doing something so tangible, eating and getting nutrients. You're out there just trawling this single line, and to be able to catch it, to do battle with it, sometimes you win, sometimes it wins. It's more like a dance than a battle. I got trigger happy there and got ahead of myself with the codes. Apologies for that. But the point is here that, you know, we did not want to constrain folks in the way that they were bringing up different kinds of activities, different kinds of benefits, different kinds of values. Our task was to code them afterwards in terms of what those statements represented in terms of our topology as being one way that we could represent that local understanding in terms that are generalizable. Now, this logic of giving real place for a kind of place-based view has become instantiated in the IPBES conceptual framework in the form of their kind of blue and green, the kind of more generalizing and more place-based perspectives. I mixed that up. The blue is the more place-based, the less generalizing, where even what we call ecosystem services has changed in that sense, recognizing that some people find too much baggage in the term ecosystem services and prefer other terms, and that's fine, right? And so the idea of nature's contributions to people is intended to be a more neutral term, given some recoil in science policy circles to the kind of baggage associated with services and factory-like metaphors associated with that. Questionable perhaps as to whether it really is more neutral, but that's certainly the effort. And so this, I'm not sure why this is so fuzzy, but the blue and green, the blue perspective being that context specific one that allows people to express ecosystem services or the benefits of nature, contributions from nature in their own terms. Now, I want to say that this goes further, right? It goes even beyond accepting what seemed so kind of essential as a part of the ecosystem services worldview of instrumental values being the only kind of way of expressing what really matters to people, apart from intrinsic values, which, you know, aren't really about people for the most part. And so this includes recognizing that for many people, the most important reasons for them to engage in conservation or stewardship activities are actually relational ones that have to do with notions of appropriate or right, desirable relationships between them and nature or between them and other people, insofar as it involves nature. And so these relational values can be both at the individual scale of a place being important to me, who I am as a person, or also parallels at the collective scale, where it's important to us collectively, my people, and to who we are as a people in terms of how we identify ourselves. There are also other ones here that I don't have time to go through, but just to point out that, you know, this class of relational values really encompasses a lot. It encompasses some moral values as well as some assigned values, which also include instrumental values. And they're overlapping, of course, right? It's not like people have purely relational values that are not at all instrumental, or in most cases that they have purely instrumental values that are don't have components of relationality. For example, when I buy food from the farmer's market, which unfortunately, thanks to COVID, haven't done in almost a year, that is both an instrumental value that I'm benefiting from, as well as a very relational one in terms of my relationship to the local farmers, as well as my commitment to local food systems. So the third part is about recognizing that the problems of equity in the distributions of ecosystem services and in the management of ecosystem services are so deep and so profoundly locked up with the status quo systems that propagate the climate and ecological crises that you can really think of the current crisis that we're facing as being a three-part crisis of inequalities, of climate, and of the broader ecological context. And so it's in this context that in the global assessment, we imagined in chapter 5 what a sustainable world might look like that actually achieved the UN Sustainable Development Goals and that was on track with the post-2020 vision for biodiversity through the Convention on Biological Diversity. And that world does involve meeting that tripartite challenge. And it involves doing so through achieving a set of kind of visions that involve diverse visions of a good life and reduce consumption, unleashing stewardship actions in ways that enable people to take those kinds of actions without unduly burdening themselves or self-sacrifice. And substantially reducing inequalities. Now, I could go on with these leverage points, but the point is that inequalities are a fundamental part of that vision for transformative change, both in terms of being an enabler of some of the other leverage points, as well as also being a target of some of the interventions at other levers and leverage points. And so in this recent paper in People and Nature, we've laid out a set of kind of scenarios or pathways by which we could achieve these levers and leverage points in order to transition global systems towards sustainability, again, for that kind of tri-part challenge. So I'll wrap up there so as not to eat into other people's time. I think I'm right around, no, I don't know how long I was, but hopefully not too long. And I really look forward to hearing what both Marta and Bonnie have to say as well.
Thanks, Kai. I think that was a really great entry point into today's discussion. And so as to have more time at the end, I will swing us right to Marta's presentation. So Marta Burbis is an assistant professor at the School for Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University. Her research considers the human dimensions of social ecological transformations in rural and urban ecosystems with an emphasis on vulnerable populations. Her work is informed by resilience thinking and political ecology at a conceptual level, and it's practically oriented towards qualitative, participatory, and anticipatory research methods. And she's going to be sharing with us today power dimensions of ecosystem services, in particular, what are power blind spots in the framing of ecosystem services and how that translates into human well-being.
Okay, I finally got to unmute myself. Good. Good morning, everybody. From Phoenix, which is the traditional land of the Akimel, Otoham, and the Peepush Nations. It's a pleasure to be sharing this insights with you. So thank you very much for the invitation to Sarah Mason and Lydia Olander for organizing all of that. And thank you to my co-panelists from today and from the day before. So today, the piece that I wanted to contribute to this conversation are really some perspectives on power relations and how they manifest in the production of ecosystem services. And furthermore, how ignoring power relations and power differentials in ecosystem service production furthers inequality. And so the way that I want to structure this talk is to talk about 3 blind spots that I think are relevant, and then to try to talk about some of the ways in which we can address and overcome these blind spots. I do want to acknowledge that these insights started at a workshop that was led and organized by Elisa Oteros Rozas and Luis Berraquero in Spain in about 2015, and that we further developed into a paper with Unai Pascual and Pepe Gonzalez. So I'm going to start by showing you two pictures. This is the Imperial Valley in California. This is one of the most productive agricultural areas in the world, and well, I mean, definitely in the United States at least. And so when we think about it, you know, very high provisioning services, it's an impressive accomplishment by all accounts. This is a picture also of the Imperial Valley in California. This is the Haltville Cemetery. This is the cemetery where the bodies of the unidentified migrants that are found in the desert are buried. And so I'm putting these two pictures together because on the one hand, we have this incredibly productive landscape. And on the other hand, we have this, you know, unspeakable human tragedy, and the two of them connected, and it's not often that the two of them are side by side. In this case, they are. But I think that this picture and this stark contrast of both human achievement and human failure really illustrates some of those blind spots. And so I'll try to name them and explain them for you. The first one, the first blind spot that I want to talk about is this trickle-down effect, this assumption that we have a trickle-down effect. And what I mean is that when we measure ecosystem services, we are often trying to assess a stock or a flow, and to estimate, you know, yields and whatnot. And so this sets us up in a logic where what we try to do is increase the size of the pie or maintain the pie of ecosystem services to increase human prosperity. And I would argue that we're measuring the wrong signal, because what we know is that commodities and provisioning services are commodities, are free to travel once they come out of that ecosystem service as an ecosystem service. And so oftentimes what happens is that the benefits of ecosystem exploitation accrue to different populations from the ones that produce them. By contrast, the negative impacts of ecosystem service production, which we know there is usually a trade-off between provisioning service and regulating services. So the decline in regulating services, and that could be in the form of soil erosion or, you know, nutrient depletion or contamination of waterways, those stay local. And so indeed it's not really uncommon to find areas that have really high yields of provisioning services, but that then are struggling and have all sorts of social and ecological challenges. And I'm focusing a lot on provisioning services, but you can think of cultural services, or how we talk about cultural services. And you can imagine that oftentimes we are establishing national parks and preserves with little regard for traditional users and stewards of the land. So that happens at all levels. The second blind spot that I wanted to talk about is this idea of an ecosystem service fetishism. So the idea of a commodity fetishism is that sometimes we emphasize so much the commodity that we forget the human labor that went into creating that commodity. And so all the ecosystem services that you may experience and benefit from were co-produced at some point. There was human labor that went into them. And so I think that, of course, there's other things that mediate ecosystem service. You can talk about policies and governments and markets, but we often acknowledge those. We never really talk very much about labor when it comes to ecosystem services. And when it comes to communities that are the producers of ecosystem services, labor really determines to a large degree their livelihoods. It shapes their livelihood and it shapes their identities, be it, you know, a farmer's community, be it a fishers or a loggers community. And yet those labor conditions in which the ecosystem services are produced, they're really hidden. That is, when we look at our assessments of total yields, it doesn't really matter how the lettuce was produced. It doesn't really matter if it was farmed in a family-owned farm or a cooperative, or if it was farmed like, you know, here in this picture that was taken in California from a couple of weeks ago, where you had raging fires and the farm workers were in the field, and so they were being exposed to toxic, you know, to the smoke and to high temperatures and whatnot. And so those conditions are hidden, and those are conditions that create inequality. The last blind spot that I want to talk about is that oftentimes when it comes to ecosystem services, we take an ahistorical view of the ecosystem service. Is really sort of like a snapshot. There's very few people who do historical analyses of ecosystem services or cultural analysis of ecosystem services. And I think that, you know, sometimes where we see like grapes from California, other people see a history of exploitation or pesticide exposure. And even before Dolores Huerta was organizing farm workers, you know, there's a displacement of indigenous populations and so on. And yet we're very good at dissociating ecosystem services from the cultural and the historical conditions in which those were created. So that's what I'll say about those 3 blind spots. And then, of course, the question is like, what do we do now? What's the way forward? How do we address those blind spots? And so I have some suggestions, and I'm open to debate them. I think one of the things that we need more of is I think the frameworks that we use to talk about power and access continue to be under theorized in our community. I think that we might be able to tell when things are wrong, inequitable, unjust, but we really need more heuristics and more language and more tools to really talk about them. Getting a little bit more practical, I think we need to do more analysis of trade-offs across scales and also across stakeholders. Again, there's few people who do this well, and it can get really complicated, but I think that if we're talking about equity and justice dimensions, we need to address the trade-offs, and we have to have a way of qualifying them or quantifying them. And last one, and I think that Kai was sort of arguing for this as well, is that we really need to start doing community level assessment. So I like that, how Kai put it, as starting from where people are. I think that the model that we have for ecosystem service, in some ways, we got it backwards. We have a supply-based model rather than looking at what people need for their well-being, how people view their environment. And I think that this is really challenging because the sort of data that we need is like this rich texture qualitative data. It's really time consuming. I spent 3 years working with rural communities in Costa Rica, and I was using participatory methods like photo voice or facet cognitive maps. And so I can say some things about 3 communities in Costa Rica. And so I think that we need to scale up those assessments and also link our efforts so that we're able to see common patterns that are impacting resource dependent communities. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for giving us that food for thought, Marta. And to round us out, I'm now going to turn us to Bonnie Keeler, who is an assistant professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at University of Minnesota. She works at the intersection of sustainability science and environmental economics, with particular expertise in water management and policy. As a member of the External Environmental Economics Advisory Committee, which is an independent organization providing nonpartisan advice on the state of economic science as it relates to the EPA's program, that's the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, she's currently reviewing recent changes to the Clean Water Act. And so today she's going to talk to us about how equity intersects with the management and policy-oriented work on ecosystem services completed by US state and federal agencies.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and it's so fun for me personally to share a stage with Kai and with Martha and their amazing work. So I'm in Minnesota. I'm actually in Northfield right now, but I do a lot of work in Minneapolis. And Minneapolis, as many of you know, has been in the headlines this summer because of a number of issues all stemming from the killing of George Floyd back on Memorial Day and the conversations about race and equity that have followed since then and really embroiled the global conversation about how we should be thinking about aligning social justice and issues of income inequality. And so I think that this is like a nice opportunity to talk about, to bring home some of the work that I've been doing and to talk about the relevance of this in almost every conversation that we're having right now. And so hopefully these talks and this webinar is providing a platform to continue to have really important conversations that we all need to be having in all of our communities right now. So I'm going to start by just talking about why this is hard, and then I'm going to talk about what we can do about it. So I present a couple of thoughts about why we haven't made more progress in integrating equity into the mainstream type of ecosystem service analyses that we do. And the first is a quick shout out to one of Kai's recent papers, as well as a couple of other reviews that have come out recently that have really showcased that the community as a whole, ecosystem service researchers and scientists, have tended to bias biophysical assessments, that we haven't really fully fleshed out all the important social dimensions of the production of ecosystem services. And from the late Georgiana Mace, this is a really nice timeline that I think helps to understand or put in context one reason why that is. And that the ecosystem services approach that really emerged in the 2000s, I think has been the result of and continues to be sort of dominated by the interaction between ecologists and economists. The idea that we can take biophysical models of how systems work and then translate those outputs into metrics of human well-being, most often in dollar terms. And we've developed a broad suite of tools to do that. But what I see is that, and Georgina talks about this in her paper, is that we're really moving into a new conversation. And I think the ecosystem services community needs to embrace this idea of a more social ecological systems approach, which means that we're thinking really interdisciplinarily, not just about the impacts of humans on the environment, but also our dependencies on environmental systems, and that there really isn't a way to disentangle the social and the ecological, and the issue of equity is so fundamental to that when you think about it as a true social ecological system. And then finally, I think that this is hard because it requires a different toolkit than economists and ecologists are traditionally trained in. So a lot of this work, as you've heard from the previous speakers, involves heavy amounts of engagement and really getting on the ground and making and forming relationships. That requires a particular set of skills. It also requires time and resources, and there's often a disconnect between the funding models, the time scales that we're working under, and the resources required to do that real genuine engagement and relationship building. And then last, I think that this concept of equity is often framed in terms of a legacy of like the concerns around siting of pollution and toxic facilities. And of course that is really relevant, but I think that that focus, or we can sort of often as ecosystem service researchers think, well, I don't work on those kinds of issues, so therefore I don't have to be attentive to equity. And I'd like to encourage us to think that equity is actually embedded in all kinds of mundane decisions that you're making if you work for a state agency, for the federal government, for a county or a municipality. So any decision has potential equity implications, whether it's capital improvements or land use planning, comprehensive plans, siting of infrastructure, permitting of facilities, developing wildlife management plans. These are just the kind of basic sets of land use and land management decisions that we're making all the time, and all of them intersect with social ecological systems. All of them intersect with dimensions of equity. So that's why this is hard and why I think the uptake has been a little slow. But I'm optimistic, and I want to present just a couple of examples of things that I think we can do right now that'll help us to elevate the conversation about equity in our work as ecosystem services practitioners. And the first is something that we all tend to do pretty well, which is just putting people on the map. This is addressing the distributional aspects of environmental justice and thinking really about the distribution of environmental benefits and burdens across populations. I do a lot of mapping of ecosystem services in Minnesota in collaboration with state agencies and local government and non-government organizations. And so we make a lot of these maps, like where in Minnesota is the most important place to spend resources on protecting or improving water quality. In this case, we're looking at both biophysical susceptibility to groundwater pollution, as well as where are the people who are drawing on that pollution, where are locations of private wells. But you can take this a step further and say, well, of those locations, where are the source water wells that are that serve populations that are below the poverty line? And now you're narrowing, again, you're focused onto another criteria that elevates the inequity in terms of ability to pay or vulnerability to changes in water quality. And the good thing is there's actually a ton of tools already available to do this kind of work. This is a screenshot of the EPA's EJ Screen tool, which aggregates a lot of census data as well as other data sources that can help you differentiate among beneficiaries and really start to elevate the distributional impacts of work in the same kind of decision support mapping approaches that I think are really common in the ecosystem services community. The other thing that I think is really critical when I talk about putting people on the map is not just understanding how we can integrate socio-demographic data to better make prioritization decisions, but also some of the embedded assumptions and how we do valuation. So Sarah noted that I've been doing a lot of work on cost-benefit analysis, federal policy on the Clean Water Act, and right now, the kind of best available economic analyses for how we evaluate those costs and benefits in federal policy often rely on benefit transfer studies. So they may take a willingness to pay study from one watershed in one area of the country and then apply that value or the assumptions embedded in that to changes in water quality in many other locations that are very far away or that serve different populations. And these maps, I think, tell a story about why that can be really problematic. So this is just one transect from Minneapolis to New Orleans. These are the counties that are adjacent to the Mississippi River. And what you can see here is there's huge gradients in household income, in education, and in race across this gradient, same watershed, but vastly different populations, vastly different contexts. And that actually really matters. It matters in how we assume people have certain preferences for natural resources. It affects people's ability to pay and why that might bias the results that we get from benefit transfer studies. And the kinds of values that I think are really important. So there are actually tools in economics to account for some of those differences in socio-demographics, including things like equity weighting. Unfortunately, there are very few practical applications of this. So I think this is a tool that's available to all of us, and I would love to see broader uptake of it, because the studies that have used things like equity weights have shown that these weights can be very consequential in resulting values of estimates of benefits and costs. Marta mentioned this as well as some of the previous talks, so I won't spend too much time on it, but I do really endorse the idea of adopting a historical perspective. This is a screenshot of collaboration that we've been working on in Minneapolis with this group called Mapping Prejudice, which maps the location of racially restrictive housing covenants. And the text from one of those covenants on a property in Minneapolis is on the screen right now. And effectively what these do is restrict property ownership to whites only. And the legacy of that is partly to explain why, for example, in Minneapolis, white families are 3 times more likely to own property than Black families. And now these are not new dynamics. These have been widely studied and discussed by scholars in geography and critical race theory and economic history for a long time, but we are seeing this kind of, these elements of historically discriminatory racist policies starting to play a mainstream role in our conversations about environmental quality. And so there's been a lot of public press recently about the impacts of redlining, for example, and how that affects the distribution of environmental benefits and burdens in contemporary timeframes. So part of understanding that historical legacy is just keeping an eye out for potential unintended consequences. I mean, we like to think of these narratives of win-wins where we can improve environmental quality and address equity issues. But often those things are very complicated, they're very complex and they're entangled. And so interventions that we might make right now to try and address those equity considerations, such as making a bunch of big investments in neighborhoods that have formerly been redlined, for example, may just lead to disinvestment or to displacement and gentrification concerns. And so it's not so easy to come in and manipulate these systems. You have to watch out for unintended consequences and thinking about our kind of green policies or green interventions and how those intersect with historical patterns of injustice in the current really unequal landscape that we're all operating under. And then 2 last things. So one, for me, a big insight has been the importance of forging new partnerships, especially across sectors. So I typically have been working with conservation groups, with biophysical modelers, with economists, and now I'm starting to work with community leaders in the housing sector. I don't know anything about housing, but I understand the importance of housing and how it intersects with environmental issues. And so this is a screenshot of a toolkit that we produced that really is a set of policy tools related to housing, but how they intersect with environmental investments and challenges associated with green gentrification. And I've been investing a lot of time in trying to figure out how we can set the stage to really empower future leaders. I strongly believe that the next generation that's coming through and really wants to engage in ecosystem services concepts is very passionate about the environmental justice dimensions of this work. And so I think we have an important job to just try and keep up with that enthusiasm, with that interest, and provide them with opportunities to build the toolkits, the skills that they need to be effective leaders in that space. And sometimes that's going to mean different types of skills than we have been trained ourselves professionally. So this is my last slide, which actually just restates, I think, things that have been discussed in previous talks. But I think I adopted a lot of what Leah and Jacqueline and Kai and Marta emphasized these points as well. But that we should focus on process over products, that we need to build relationships and move at the speed of trust, that we need to embrace multiple ways of knowing. And that means personally adopting a willingness to be transformed by the work that we're doing and take it in new directions. We need to show up and take the temperature of a system, as Danilo Meadows would say. And that means reading, it means volunteering, it means listening in ways that we maybe haven't. And that history matters, and institutions like universities, like federal agencies, we have complicated legacies. We take those with us when we start to do this kind of work, and it's important to really understand and acknowledge those power dynamics.
Thanks, Bonnie, for giving us some on-the-ground examples of how these equity issues play out for managers and planners of various kinds. So I'll turn us now to the discussion portion of this webinar. Again, if you'd like to ask any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box, and I'll try to intersperse them during this question and answer period. And I will kick it off with a general question, which is actually the same way I kicked off the discussion for part one, but I think it's just helpful to hear your perspectives. Is why do you think that using an ecosystem services lens is helpful for thinking about equity and environmental justice as they relate to the management of natural resources? And so unless someone wants to jump in immediately, I might call on Kai and have him kick us off here.
So I'm not going to distinguish here between an ecosystem services lens and then nature's contribution to people's lens. I'm going to just lump them together. And, you know, I mean, I think that recognizing that there are multiple streams of benefits that come from complex systems to multiple different sets of beneficiaries is a key part of getting at those distributional issues. And so a good entry point for thinking about equity in that context. But, you know, as so many of us have talked about in this webinar, you know, we've all also been attending to those other aspects. And I think that, you know, the fact that the concept does first illuminate those distributional outcomes, that is really, it becomes obvious in a way as a result of seeing the world through ecosystem services or nature's contributions to people. But then, of course, you know, there's all these other aspects associated with the programs and the way that we go about doing our research, the process that that Marta and Bonnie and others raised, that, you know, that make it so that these are all crucial considerations that are enabled by that first kind of role of recognizing the complexity of the relationships between humans and ecosystems.
I would just add to that that I think that the reason why I like to think of ecosystem services is that it brings together, is one of the few heuristics that bring together that relation, that dynamic relations between humans and nature. And I think that that's what I'm interested in. But I think as Bonnie and Kai point out, that term starts with ecology, and so and with economic needs, and so it doesn't actually address many of these deeper questions, and that I think like that's where we're pushing towards.
Thanks. Bonnie, unless you wanted to add anything, I will move on to the next question. Okay. I have a question here from someone who sent it in at registration, asking about best practices for ensuring you capture equity in the different phases of a project. So this, I guess, could be a research project or also some kind of environmental management project. And you know, I don't think we can prescribe anyone a step-by-step recipe, but maybe if you could share one tip you've used to do this or one surprising way you've seen someone else do it that you think would be helpful to share with the group here today.
I can say one thing and then I'll pass it along. But, you know, I think that having often the projects that really embrace equity require some longer term engagement and relationship building. And those are often asynchronous with the grant application cycles. So you have to be really creative to think about ways to do that. Although I do see some shifts in funding agencies that are much more willing now to fund that kind of exploratory relationship development work. So if that's work that you're interested in, I do see that people are now willing to put more resources and recognize that there's a long time that it takes to really start to build the kind of meaningful engagements that are needed to think about getting to more of a co-development model with respect to designing a study. Then my second tip is really just that there's actually so much more that we can all do to educate ourselves about the context that we're working in. And often that means we have to look outside of the academic literature. So I tell my students, you know, if you're interested in studying a particular area, like, are you following the reporters who report on that area? Are you reading the local newspapers and blogs of community members? Are you attending their webinars? Are you signed up for their newsletters and their mailing lists? Are you showing up for community meetings and just being a fly on the wall and listening to the concerns that are raised? Have you read a social and ecological history of the watershed that you're in? What efforts have you taken personally to try and really educate yourself about the systems that you're working in? Not just the biophysical data or the modeling, but really like the origin story and the people of the places that we're working in. And that's stuff that we can all do, that we should just make and internalize as part of our practice as researchers.
Kai or Marta, anything?
So my tip, in addition to that, and I think that Bonnie had a really great list at the end of her presentation of, you know, emphasizing process and relationships and trust building and whatnot. I think that one thing that I've noticed is that it's really hard to start something and convince people to join whatever it has been your call and that you think that everybody should be caring about. I think that you guarantee a more successful outcome if you are actually able to scan what's going on in those communities and see what they actually care about and join, rather than you lead as the white savior that you are, and trying to get everybody on board.
Thanks. Okay. And I have a question that came in. Someone's asking about thoughts on ways to quantify or monitor equity in relation to ecosystem services outcomes, so that inequities can be highlighted. And I think this kind of relates back to your point, Marta, about, you know, the fact that maybe a more traditional monitoring might just measure output of something like lettuce and doesn't integrate the labor or production behind that. So I guess my question is, how have any of you seen successful monitoring of equity in this context before? Any thoughts?
I might just respond first to that, leaving space also for Bonnie and Marta to join in as well. I think there's lots of ways to do this monetarily or quantify equity implications, but I would also resist that in a sense, right? And resist the kind of urge to see equity primarily through a quantified lens, because so much of what really matters in terms of equity considerations can't be easily quantified, right? Like, the fancy math is not going to solve the problem. And I think most of what Bonnie and Marta and I talked about go beyond the kind of, you know, the equity weighting, for example, right? I mean, that's a useful tool, but it's one of like maybe half a dozen points that we raised. And so, you know, I think it's key to keep an open mind about that, and to, you know, to do what you can in terms of thinking about appropriate ways to represent it in quantitative terms, but then also not to be shy of using other forms of evidence that include narratives and quotes and stories, and, you know, and the other forms of evidence that Bonnie was mentioning in her tips for students, which I think is a great list. That's super.
Yeah, absolutely multiple forms of evidence, and absolutely embracing really pluralistic approaches to describing these systems. And that's backed up by evidence too. I mean, when we've talked to stakeholders, they're actually quite skeptical about those monetary values, and people are motivated by stories, and by the stories especially that emerge from constituencies that they care about. So elevating those, I think, is a very effective tactic. And then I also think being able to let communities articulate what their own environmental futures look like is really important. And that's a huge insight for me in the work we've been doing in Minneapolis, where we really came in with some ideas about what the big environmental justice issues were in communities. And we spent a lot of time with those communities and showing up and listening, and quickly realized that that wasn't what they wanted to talk about. That wasn't, those weren't the issues. They were really concerned about issues of gentrification, and they were really concerned about issues of housing and job security. And so we shifted the entire project as a result of that insight. And it means that I had to move into content areas that I was very, very uncomfortable working on. But it was sort of the ethos of the project to be responsive to the needs of community members. So, I mean, that's a difficult lift, I think, for organizations, especially if you're sort of narrowly focused on one toolkit in your toolbox, which is like maybe building parks or something like that. And that's why I think these sort of cross-sector partnerships are really important. But I also really love the work that researchers have been doing, and I know Marta's done some of this work, and Kai, but just allowing communities to envision future scenarios, like envision what a just future looks like for them, as opposed to a priori coming in and saying, well, here's a green pathway, and here's a business as usual pathway, and here's a, some other pathway, but letting them sort of do that envisioning yourself, and being often being surprised or being interested in what the results are that may be very, very different than what we come in thinking that future should look like.
I'll just add to that I think some of the best way of measuring equity outcomes, it's context specific. So you probably are better off if you co-develop those things with what is meaningful in that context. So I think I'm just adding or echoing what Kai and Bonnie are saying.
Yes, so no easy answer, unfortunately, but that's probably better to incorporate the complexity. All right, I have a question that came in through the chat asking about whether you are seeing a shift within the ecosystem services community from focusing primarily on economic or income inequality to a broader consideration of sort of the intersectional parts of equity and ecosystem services. So this person says they've so far mostly seen studies that consider income and race, but not so much on gender, disability, religion, other things like that. And they'd like to hear your thoughts on where the ecosystem services field is headed. Anyone want to jump in? Otherwise I can call on somebody.
I feel bad because I started on the last one, but this question is very much on my mind because that paper that Bonnie highlighted that just came out in People in Nature with Terry Satterfield called The Maturation of Ecosystem Services was really about that as a major part of the story. So this was looking over 3 decades of ecosystem services scholarship and watching the kind of growth in some areas and the kind of stagnation in other areas. And it's quite impressive, actually, the growth in the consideration of those, broader concerns about equity. It really has grown a lot more, for example, than the policy effectiveness studies, right? Those have been more or less flat in terms of as a proportion of the ecosystem services literature. But the considerations of equity have grown considerably and become more diverse in the ways that you were talking about in your question. But that said, many of those kind of social aspects started from a very, very small beginning, right? Like they started from almost zero. So a lot of growth from zero still doesn't add up to a majority, right? So there's still a lot of the ecosystem services literature at our last count that was not including these kinds of considerations. So there's still a lot more room for growth.
Yeah. That's a great, if you're like a student looking for a dissertation project, that would be, those are all under appreciated dimensions and the intersection across those different dimensions we so desperately need more people to be thinking about that. And there could be so many creative ways to look at that problem and really demonstrate the value of taking that approach and how consequential it is to our understanding of these social ecological systems. So absolutely we need more. I do agree with Kai that there's a growing awareness and a growing need for this. I think the only caveat I would say is just that there's actually decades and decades and decades of scholarship on these topics, and so to not fall into the trap of like rediscovering gender inequality through the lens of ecosystem services, when we recognize that, you know, feminist economists and scholars have been looking at issues of intersectionality and topics like that for decades. So often by going outside of your literature comfort zone, you may find that you have an appreciation for these topics in ways that other scholars have developed sort of rich understandings and articulations of.
All right. Well, I do want to be respectful of people's time. We are just about at the hour mark. And so I think we can end it there with kind of a call for any students on the line to maybe think about a project that might incorporate something like this, or anyone else. You don't have to be a student to start moving into these sort of undiscovered areas of ecosystem services research. So I just want to say one last thank you to Bonnie, Kai, and Marta for joining today. We so appreciate your time and energy and effort in putting these presentations together and for sharing them with all of us. And I will send everyone off for a good morning, evening, night, depending on where you're joining from in the world. So thanks again.